Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the second installment of Missouri Prairie Foundation's Prairie webinar series. My name is Felicia Ammon. I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. For our second talk in the series, we will be hearing from Mike Leahy, a tour of Missouri's natural communities with special emphasis on prairies and other native grasslands. Mike has worked for over 25 years with state agencies in Indiana, Virginia, and Missouri on the conservation of natural resources. Most of this work has been with the Missouri Department of Conservation, serving in the roles of regional natural history biologist, heritage community ecologist, and natural areas coordinator. Be sure to check out the rest of our Prairie webinar series that runs on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. until about 4:45 through the end of May. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Well, hello everybody in webinar land. I'm Mike Leahy, and I work, like Felicia said, with the Missouri Department of Conservation as an ecologist. And today we're going to take a tour of our fascinating Missouri's natural communities with a special emphasis on prairies and other grasslands. Now, Missouri as a state has a very rich native biological diversity. Here in Missouri, we have over 2,000 native vascular plant species, over 400 different types of native bee species, 120 native butterfly and skipper species, and at least 60 native reptile species. And for lots of different taxonomic groups like fungi and invertebrates, we really don't know how many species we have. So as conservationists, it's really hard to manage for all this diversity on a species by species basis. We can do that for certain high profile species, like things like bald eagles or white-tailed deer. But for most of our species, we don't know enough about their life history to manage on a species by species basis. So what we do is we try to manage their habitats or their natural communities and hope that we can capture managing for most of the species by managing for natural communities and conserving these different community types. So in order to conserve all these different species, we have to have a classification system to define the different community types that all these native plants and animals occur in. And so we have a wonderful resource, the Terrestrial Natural Communities of Missouri book by Paul Nelson, that defines our different natural communities. And these are defined technically distinct assemblages or groups of native plants, animals, and microorganisms that occur in repeatable patterns across the landscape and through time. So and throughout the state, where you have areas that have similar soils, geology, and climate, then you have different, natural communities that we can define and describe the different plants and animals that occur there. So first of all, we'll start with the physical factors of the state. These are really important in terms of what plants and animals occur where. And the first pattern to look at are the regional climate patterns. So if you go up from northwest Missouri, north of St. Joe to the Boot Heel or southeast Missouri, there's a big range of climate. We go from 34 inches of precipitation in northwest Missouri, north of St. Joe, to over 50 inches in the southeast part of the state in places like Kennett. So that is a big range of temperature and precipitation. Then we look at what site or what a site has in terms of its geologic parent material. Is it deep soil from glaciers, or is it igneous rock like shown here? Then we get a close look at soils to define our community types. What's the soil moisture regime, the texture of the soil? Is it gravelly or silty? The depth of the rooting zone for plants, and the pH, the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. The lay of the land is always important. What type of landform are you on? Are you on a side slope or a river valley or a ridge top? The position on the ridge or the valley that you're in, the aspect, whether you're a cooler north and east facing slope or a hotter, drier west and south facing slope. These all make a big difference in what plants and animals we find on our landscape. Then we look at the different structure of the vegetation. Is it mainly forested with big tall trees at maturity? Or is it covered in shrubs? Or is it more herbaceous like a prairie? These all help to define a natural community. The thing about natural communities is that they include both habitat generalist species, but they also include all these specialist species that really only are found in our natural communities. So like here in my backyard, I can find common ragweed, white-tailed deer, and in town and city parks, you can find Canada geese, and you can find these species in natural communities as well, but they aren't dependent on natural communities. They can be found pretty much anywhere in our landscape today. What really makes natural communities unique and special are these remnant-dependent habitat specialist species. These include things like downy gentian, the regal fritillary butterfly, and the northern crawfish frog. And a lot of our habitat specialist species have really interesting and complex life cycles. So for instance, the regal fritillary butterfly, as a caterpillar, it feeds pretty much just on 3 species, only 3 in Missouri, of violet. And these include the prairie violet, the bird's foot violet, and the sagittate violet. And we only really find these violets in critical mass on remnant prairies. Another remnant-dependent species is the northern crawfish frog. It uses burrows that the grassland crayfish makes for its shelter. And of course, having a critical mass of grassland crayfish are typically found in unplowed prairie soils. And then consider the rattlesnake borer moth. As a caterpillar, this moth species feeds exclusively on rattlesnake borer stems. So it's these remnant-dependent species that really characterize our natural communities and make them different from, say, old fields or other degraded habitats. And a signature feature of an intact natural community is an unplowed, intact soil. So in a study that the University of Missouri and the U.S. Department of Agriculture did a few years ago, they looked at the soil microbial biomass, or the soil microbial community, in the different soils on the same soil type of Tucker Prairie Natural Area, a reconstructed prairie that was 20 years old on the same soil type, and then a field that had been in corn and soybean production for years and years. And they found that, not surprisingly, Tucker Prairie had 4 times as much soil microbial biomass as the cultivated field, and twice as much as the reconstructed prairie. So again, these intact soils are really key to our natural communities, and it takes decades and decades to rebuild that soil once it's been altered like that. But our communities are not static. They depend on different ecological processes to ensure their health. And so these include key processes like fire, flooding, soil saturation, drought, windstorms, ice storms, and herbivory. And herbivory includes everything from invertebrates, such as shown here, up to larger mammals. Another thing is the geography of our state. So if you look across Missouri, we've subdivided the state into 4 main ecological regions based on the soils, again, geology, topography, hydrology, and historic vegetation patterns. And the patterns of our native plants and animals and communities are really tied closely to these different regions. These include the glaciated plains, the Osage plains of west central Missouri, the Ozark Highlands, and the southeastern Mississippi lowlands. And then based on drainage basins, hydrology, geology, landforms, soils, and vegetation, we can define 16 major natural community types in Missouri. This can include, or these do include, I should say, 85 different terrestrial and cave communities and 35 aquatic communities. Now, aquatic communities are extremely important in our state, but the focus of this talk is going to be on the terrestrial above ground communities. We have 7 major community types of terrestrial types in the state. These include forest, woodland, savanna, prairie, glade, cliff and talus, and wetlands. And we'll briefly describe these types, and then we'll go into detail about our native grasslands, which will focus in on prairie, of course, and glades, and a little bit on savannas. So forests are defined by, at maturity, a complete canopy of trees, multiple layers of both trees that are shade tolerant and shrubs such as pawpaw, and then a ground layer that is rich in spring ephemerals like trilliums, bloodroot, species like that. Forests are typically on north and east facing slopes, and they're characterized by different species like the pileated woodpecker and the ringed salamander. Now, at the other end, a lack of trees, less than 10% cover, are our native prairies. But prairies are more than just a lack of tree cover. They're rich, as we'll find out in this talk, in many different species of plants and animals, and they're dominated by grasses, sedges, and wildflowers. These are fire-adapted communities. Now, savannas are transitional areas between the grasslands and the forests. And Missouri as a whole is in a broad ecotone between the grasslands of the Great Plains to our west and the eastern deciduous forest to our east. And the mixing zone here in Missouri includes these different communities like savannas and woodlands. And savannas are essentially prairies with trees. This one at Long Branch State Park is one of the few rare examples of savannas left. We have even less savanna habitat or natural community left in Missouri than we do tallgrass prairie. And what you find are typical tallgrass prairie species in between the trees, and then in the shade line of the trees you find woodland species. We have a lot of areas that structurally look like savannas today with our parks and golf courses and fescue savannas, and these do support some savanna wildlife, but they aren't the same as a remnant savanna. Now, a lot of the Ozarks are dominated by dry, rocky soil or low fertility soil, and historically fire was a very important component of these sites. Classic woodlands are areas that have short-statured trees, drought-adapted tree species like post oaks, and when managed with fire and thinning such that the canopy cover is between 30 to 90% with an open midstory as shown here at Hahatonka State Park, you get a really rich expression of different native grasses, sedges, and then a lot of native legumes and composites. Glades that we'll refer to again later are essentially open grasslands in a wooded landscape. However, they merge with woodlands and form a mosaic. These aren't necessarily completely discrete areas on the landscape, but they're a way for us to manage them by identifying these different community types. Glades, like prairies, are fire adapted and dominated by herbaceous plants. Cliffs are very easy to recognize. You know one when you're on one. They're vertical exposures of rock dominated by a sparse flora, and typically at the base of a cliff you'll find what we call talus communities where the eroded rock has built up. Then in Missouri, we have many wetland community types that are defined by their hydrology. And these include areas that have what we call hydric soil and obligate wetland species that are adapted to flooding or soil saturation. So we have wetlands that are dominated by groundwater seepage that's often calcareous that we call fens, mainly in the Ozarks. We also have many wooded wetland natural communities such as swamps shown here at Allred Lake that are dominated by overflow flooding and also occur in depressional areas and floodplains. And we also have many herbaceous wetlands that we call marshes that again are dependent on ponded water and flooding. Now, many years ago, back in the 70s, the Conservation Department and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources State Parks Division began a program called the Natural Areas Program. And the goal of the program was then, and is still today, to conserve and protect our remnant natural communities and significant geologic features for future generations. Since the 70s, a number of other agencies have come on board, including the National Scenic Riverways, the Mark Twain National Forest, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Nature Conservancy. And the Jack in the Pulpit here, which is a drawing that Charlie Schwartz did, is the logo of the program. Our natural areas are reservoirs of a lot of our native biological diversity. So they disproportionately contain a number of different rare and declining species, including 38% of all the known rare and declining species that we have documented in the state. And this includes 19 federally listed species such as the Mead's milkweed and Hines emerald dragonfly, and 34 state endangered species. There are now today 191 natural areas that cover about 95,000 acres of land, and 90% of these are open to public visitation. Now let's focus in on our prairies. So prairie is a French word for meadow, which also is derived from a Latin word for meadow, prater, I believe. And the word stuck for our North American prairies when early French explorers, such as like Joliet and Marquette, explored the interior of the US. So Joliet and Marquette in 1673 took a trip from St. Ignace, Canada, down the Mississippi and then back up the Illinois River. And they documented many prairies at that time in prairie wildlife. Now our prairies here in Missouri are what we call tall grass prairies. That means the vegetation is typically pretty robust on good soils, getting over 6 feet tall on productive soils. However, our prairies range from dry site prairies here in Missouri that can be only 2 feet tall at maturity to those that are over 6 feet tall. Now, west of here, if we go into central Kansas, then we get what are called midgrass prairies. And then by the time we get to western Kansas, eastern Colorado, we get into the shortgrass prairie country. Tallgrass prairies are dominated or typified by species like big bluestem and switchgrass. Midgrass species, which also mix in our tallgrass prairies, these aren't hard and fast rules, include side oats, grama, and little bluestem. And then shortgrass species include things like blue grama. Now here in Missouri, we have 5 dominant native warm season grasses. This includes big bluestem, little bluestem, prairie dropseed, Indian grass, and switchgrass. Now these grasses use the C4 photosynthetic pathway, which makes them more water use efficient and drought tolerant. In addition, the leaves of grasses have much less surface area for evapotranspiration than tree leaves. But prairies, of course, are much more than just native warm season grasses. They include cool season native grasses like June grass, many different sedges, numbers of different rush species, and a large variety of wildflowers ranging from things like shooting star, lead plant, compass plant, and sky blue aster. In fact, over 800 different native plant species have been documented on our Missouri prairies. And assuming you're sitting down in a seat right now, within an area that is about the size of the base of a seat, about a 1/4 meter square, Justin Thomas and other biologists with the Institute for Botanical Training found 46 different species in an area that's about this big at Missouri Prairie Foundation's Pennsylvania Prairie. So it's an astonishing amount of plant diversity. And that translates into an astonishing amount of invertebrate diversity. That includes over 200 native bee species, such as the blue sage bee, that occur on our native prairies, 100 different butterfly and moth species, and 100 native beetle species. And these are all great native pollinators. Now, the story or history of our prairies in Missouri dates back about 15,000 years ago when there was an ice sheet over the lake states called the Laurentide ice sheet. Anyways, that ice sheet obviously went away and melted. And from about 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, we had a period that was known as the hypsothermal period. And this hypsothermal period was a warmer, drier period in which the prairies of the West moved eastward. And they were pushed or aided by Native Americans as well as lightning fire, but a lot of it was Native American fire. And as you can see, the prairies moved all the way. There were remnant prairies in Ohio and even smaller ones in Virginia and North Carolina, and then down into the Gulf Coast area. And fire is the lifeblood of our tallgrass prairie. So without fire, our climate here in Missouri is such that we grow trees pretty rapidly. So it was the influence largely of Native American fire with occasional wildfires from lightning that helped maintain and propagate our prairies. And the Native Americans used fire for a wide variety of cultural reasons. Another signature feature of prairie is that most of the biomass, 2/3 of it, is below ground, which is different than our forests where only 1/3 of the biomass is below ground. having all this biomass below ground has led to these rich prairie soils that we call mollisoils that are rich in carbon and nutrients and organic matter. Of course, the richness of this prairie soil was one of the main reasons that the prairies have suffered from conversion to agriculture and have led to their demise. And so what we know from historical records and from soil maps as well to corroborate this, we know that at the time of statehood in 1821, at least a third of Missouri conservatively, or 15 million acres, was in tall grass prairie. That's shown here in the kind of light orange. Unfortunately, less than 1% of that prairie remains today, and so it's a very critical resource for our natural heritage. Now, when we talk about prairie natural communities, we've identified 12 different separate types, mainly based on soil moisture and the substrate that the prairie develops in. And it's kind of important to understand the different soil moisture regimes as we discuss this. So we have dry soils that are very well drained to excessively well drained. And for these, you want to think side oats, grama grass habitat. Dry mesic soils, the water's drained, but not rapidly, but not too rapidly. And this is kind of ideal habitat for little and big blue stem. Mesic soils are moderately well drained. And for this, culver's root and bunch flower are characteristic. Wet mesic soils are somewhat poorly drained, so they can be seasonally wet or have a shallow water table at certain times of the year. And this is preferred habitat for eastern gamma grass. And then wet soils, which are hydric soils and wetland soils, are poorly drained, typically in floodplains. And this is ideal habitat for cordgrass. The main difference between prairie communities are really between the upland prairies and the bottomland prairies, with bottomland prairies such as this at Marmaton River Bottoms Natural Area being very different from our upland prairies in terms of hydrology and soils. Now, this nice cross-sectional diagram that Paul Nelson did in the Natural Community book really shows kind of a neat cross-section across the landscape of how our prairie communities align. Of course, nature is never as simple as this, and there's always exceptions to the rule, and there aren't any hard, fast lines in many cases between one community type into the other. They kind of grade into each other. It's us humans that like to subdivide nature into these pigeonholes. So we've got prairie swales in the low spots in a loess soil, which is a wind-blown soil that's deposited. We have mesic prairies. We have dry mesic prairies, again, on the loess glacial till soils. Then in areas with bedrock, you might get a dry mesic, either on limestone or dolomite prairie. Then lower in the landscape, we can get wet mesic bottomland prairies, and then the final lowest point of the landscape will get wet bottomland prairies. So let's discuss the different details of these prairie types. So we have 50,000 prairie left in the state. About half of that is within the community type we know as dry mesic sandstone shale prairie. So it's our most common remnant prairie that's left, such as a golden prairie natural area shown here. These occur in the Osage Plains and Springfield Plateau portions of the state. And most of the remnant prairies that we have left of this type are on the sandstone soils. Most of the shale soils have weathered into decent soil, and so most of these were converted into agriculture. But the sandstone soils were really too rocky to plow for the early European American settlers, and so they often were used as hay meadows. And that's really how we've inherited many of these prairies today, is that they were managed as hay meadows and not converted to agriculture. And these prairies are typically on moderate to gentle slopes. Little and big blue stem are the dominant grasses, but then there's a whole number of wildflowers that characterize these prairies that are typically acidic in their soil. And this includes pale purple coneflower, lead plant, rosinweed, prairie blazing star, cream wild indigo, and sky blue aster. Some of the more conservative species that occur in our sandstone shale prairies include southern prairie aster, which is more of a western, kind of the western third of Missouri is where this species range is, grass pink orchid, and the prairie mole cricket. And again, to underscore how little we know about invertebrates and other poorly studied taxonomic groups, this little story about the Phylobrotica physostegia, this leaf beetle here, illustrates that point. In 1979, Father Sullivan, who's an entomologist, discovered this species on Taborville Prairie in Missouri. And later, of course, this species was found in other sandstone shale prairies, but as a leaf beetle, it feeds on a host plant known as narrowleaf false dragonhead. But it was new to science. And if experts look, they may find other new species. But we really haven't documented all the stuff that's going on in our prairies. Typical reptile species of our sandstone shale prairies include bull snake, the plains box turtle, and southern prairie skink. These, of course, are typical species, though, of a lot of the different prairie community types that are in the uplands of southwest Missouri. Now, after sandstone shale prairies, the second most common prairie community type left in our state are dry mesic chert prairies. These are areas that have limestone soils where the limestone has dissolved away and left a mantle of chert rock with a thin layer of loess silt loam soil on the top. And again, like the sandstone shale prairies, the reason we have a lot of these prairies left is because they were often too rocky to plow. Now, there are some dry mesic chert prairies, I should say, that have more limestone influence. And so you'll get some species that are calcium requiring and don't like the acidic soils in little pockets of these chert prairies. But the overall soil pH on our chert prairies is usually acidic. These are usually on gently sloping to moderately sloping terrain. And one of the dominant signature species within the grass world are on the chert prairies are prairie dropseed. Other signature species of our chert prairies include royal catchfly, of which Missouri is really the epicenter of the species distribution. It's listed as a species of conservation concern in all the other states it occurs in. Fringed poppy mallow is another one that's typically on our chert prairies of southwest Missouri. Now, a very different prairie type are what we call hard pan or clay pan prairies, and these have a layer of clay or a very cemented layer of silt at a depth in the soil that allows for water to pond or be saturated in the winter and spring, but then in the summertime, that same soil can become as hard and dry as cement. An example of this is Tucker Prairie Natural Area. There used to be an area in Missouri known as the Grand Prairie, which was a large area here that was almost all prairie, much like the Osage Plains and Springfield Plateau, and it extended from east of Columbia all the way up to Hannibal, Missouri. Unfortunately, Tucker Prairie is really the only large remnant of that landscape left. And within our hardpan prairies, it's interesting. You get certain species like rattlesnake master, white wild indigo, and prairie blazing star that thrive, but then other typical prairie species that we think of, like pale purple coneflower, are not found on our hardpan prairies. The pale purple coneflower doesn't like to have its feet saturated during the growing season. Dry mesic limestone or dolomite prairies are formed in soils that have weathered from limestone or dolomite, so they're high in calcium. They often have a near neutral pH, and they can be very fertile. So we have less examples of this community type, and where we do, they tend to be more rocky than some other areas that have this kind of soil. And these areas support species that depend on, like I said, a lot of calcium in the soil. And here in Missouri, the only place on a prairie that we get prairie dock, which is typical on our glades on limestone and dolomite, are on these limestone dolomite soils, which is different than if we go to the east of here in Illinois. Prairie dock will occur on multiple different soil types because the glaciated soil in Illinois is much higher in calcium than our prairie soils here in Missouri. Some other characteristic species include prairie turnip and stiff aster. Now, some ecologists also define a dry limestone dolomite prairie type, but personally, I can't find much difference between these and glades. Now, moving to the north, much of North Missouri was blanketed in tall grass prairie, and of course, hence with these deep glacial soils derived from loess and glacial till, Most of these areas have been converted to agriculture, but there are some gems like Pawnee Prairie and others that still survive. The glacial deposits here in North Missouri are much older than the ones to the north and east of us in Illinois and Iowa. Our glacial deposits are over 500,000 years old, and so they're more leached and not quite as productive as the black soil prairies of Iowa and Illinois. These prairies occur on silt loams and clay silt loams, and they tend to be left on areas that were a little bit too steep to plow. Some signature species of North Missouri prairies include prairie cinquefoil and the prairie lily. Now, mesic prairie is found in North Missouri and is our kind of epitomizes what we think of as tall grass prairie, where somebody could get lost riding in horseback across a prairie in the grasses and wildflowers. Because of that productivity, though, we have almost none of this prairie left, but where we do, it's extremely valuable, and it often harbors populations of either the western or eastern prairie fringed orchid. And interestingly enough, most orchids, of course, have mycorrhizal fungal associates, but some specialist species like the western prairie fringed orchid have been found to have even more rare mycorrhizal fungi that associate with them than less rare orchid species. Now moving to the very far northwest portion of the state, north of St. Joe, we have these steep bluffs above the Missouri River floodplain that are formed of loess soil that after the glaciation, the large floodplains were covered in flood deposits, and that fine-grained silt soil was then blown across the landscape and piled up in these loess hills. And these loess hills are kind of like a string of pearls of prairie openings that typically have species that we find 100 miles to the west that are known as more shortgrass species. Some of these characteristic species include things like nine-anthered dahlia, dotted blazing star, and hairy grama. Now moving to more wet sites in our prairie landscape, at the uppermost portions of the watershed within our first order streams and ephemeral drainages, we have these microhabitats known as prairie swales. And these prairie swales harbor more moisture-loving species such as bunchflower, Culver's root, sedges, cordgrass, things like Helianthus grossoserratus. So it's a microhabitat within a larger prairie landscape that really adds to the overall community diversity of a site. Now, across the state, we also have bottomland prairies in the floodplains, and these were quite extensive in west central Missouri as well as in north Missouri. And the signature species here is cordgrass, which is host to a cute little planthopper that only feeds on cordgrass, known as the cordgrass planthopper. And our bottomland prairies, of course, are extremely rich when drained and protected from flooding for agriculture. So there's another community type that has really seen a lot of conversion. And a lot of these areas suffer from altered hydrology and lots of sedimentation or siltation, which has really made management of them a difficult challenge. Some of the characteristic species of our bottomland prairies include Sullivan's milkweed, swamp milkweed, sawtooth sunflower, and different herb species like the Midland brown snake. And then in North Missouri, the prairie massasauga is a species of conservation concern. The last prairie community type we'll cover are sand prairies, which is an almost extinct community type that occurs on sand deposits in the Mississippi lowlands, as well as the floodplain of the Missouri River, the Mississippi River in North Missouri. These areas support typical drier plant species of prairies, but also a number of sand prairie specialist species such as jointweed or dotted bean balm, and they have interesting invertebrate communities and some other interesting plant and animal species, including things like the dusty hognose snake. This is, of course, in the southeast lowlands sand prairies, and prairie swales that occur within these southeast lowland sand prairies often are habitat for the Illinois chorus frog. Now, in covering these natural communities, I haven't gone into depth about grassland birds, including things like upland sandpipers and Henslow sparrows. And as a group, in a later webinar that the Prairie Foundation is putting on, you'll hear from Sarah Kendrick, the state ornithologist, and she'll be talking in more detail about bird species and their conservation. Grassland birds as a whole are the steepest declining bird group in North America. However, it is important to note that while our grassland birds, such as Henslow sparrows and sandpipers, thrive on remnant native prairie, they're not dependent upon native remnant prairie in the same way as, say, a regal fritillary butterfly or a grass pink orchid. They can use other habitats, including native grass plantings, and things that are not necessarily remnant prairie. Now, along with prairie in Missouri, we have a large acreage of these communities called glades that a number of ecologists have often called xeric prairies. They're fire adapted, and in the absence of fire, eastern red cedar, which is a species native to cliff edges historically, but in the absence of pre-settlement fire, of course, eastern red cedar has exploded across our landscape. In fact, the early land surveyors of the General Land Survey Office noted eastern red cedar like in 1% of the survey lines they surveyed across the state, which would be completely different today. So anyways, eastern red cedar, in the absence of fire, will take over our glades and form a low diversity monoculture. But otherwise, with fire and restoration thinning, our glades are essentially these xeric prairies in our Ozark landscape. And they harbor species like little blue stem, side oats grama, lead plant, pale purple coneflower, species like white prairie clover, purple prairie clover, species that are typical in our prairies, but they also have a lot of glade-specific species. So that includes things such as, go back, glade coneflower, Echinacea simulata. Now this range map shows a map that Paul Nelson and others put together that maps a good snapshot of most of the glades that we know in the state. And you'll see that there's a wide arc through the Ozarks and even the Ozark border region, then up even into the Lincoln Hills of North Missouri and into the Osage Plains. But the largest concentration is down centered around an area between Ava and Cassville, Missouri. And this is the White River drainage, and that's where we find our largest and most extensive glade areas. Glades are defined based on the bedrock type they occur on. So that can be limestone or dolomite, which are both are calcareous or calcium-rich or neutral soil pH substrates, and then acidic substrates like the igneous rock in the St. Francis Mountains area, which is, of course, a volcanic-derived rock, sandstone, glades, and then a very globally rare community type are chert glades just around the Joplin area. We mentioned glade coneflower as a glade endemic species. We also have Bush's skullcap, narrowleaf gayfeather, and then glade-specific animal species here in Missouri, like the collared lizard and the lichen grasshopper. And there are over 158,000 acres of glades in Missouri. Of course, most of them are degraded, but they are an incredible opportunity for restoration. And one heartening and large-scale restoration project has occurred on the Mark Twain National Forest Ava District, where they've removed cedar and done large prescribed burns to restore, in this case at Ava Glades National Area, over 1,500 acres of glades, with some being over 800 acres in size. And these are really, in this White River drainage, extensive grassland habitat in our state. And glade restoration offers the opportunity to further conserve a lot of the prairie species, plant species, in terms of the genetic diversity, since we have a lot less prairie to work with than we do with glades. Obviously, restoring both is very important, and prairies are more rare, but there is a tremendous opportunity here in the state for grassland glade restoration. Now, the best way, of course, to visit a prairie, or to learn about a prairie, I should say, is to visit prairies throughout the season and through different years, because prairies vary tremendously. It's particularly a prairie that hasn't been burned for 2 or 3 years, has a very different look and feel than visiting a prairie the spring after a prescribed fire occurred that fall or winter. It's very variable. And of course, drought years and wet years, they all influence the expression of the native plants and the invertebrate communities. So at multiple visits throughout growing season and over the years is the best way to get familiar with the prairie. And for more information about our prairies in Missouri and places to visit, you can visit the Missouri Prairie Foundation's website, as well as the Missouri Natural Areas online directory shown here. Now, prairies are not static entities, and in today's landscape, we need active stewardship to maintain this diversity, and it can be really very labor and monetarily intensive to maintain and restore this natural heritage that we have in our state. We have to continue to do prescribed burns. We have to spot treat invasive exotic species. We have to, restore and buffer around remnant prairies with prairie plantings. And so there's a whole suite of things that need to happen to maintain our prairies. It's a community type that's very time and labor intensive to maintain. So restoration and management are key to maintaining this natural heritage that we have in the state. And to maintain, of course, what we know is a globally imperiled ecosystem type, our tallgrass prairie. Just want to give credit to lots of excellent photographers out there. And at this point, I guess we can open it up to questions or comments.
Thank you, Mike. This is Carol David. I'm the director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and thank you very much for your presentation. And I thank Felicia Ammon for running the webinar. Yes, we do have some questions, and the first question that we had several questions come in. I was able to address a number of them, but one question that came in was about, can you speak to the effects of herbicides on soil microbes, especially like prairie soil microbes, or part of the question was about agricultural chemicals, but of course in original prairies, it's not agriculture, but maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I could try. I would have to do some research and talking to other experts to find out more. Of course, in an agricultural landscape where you have, say, row crop agriculture right next to a prairie or nearby, you're going to have drift. And so you might have some impact on the soil microbial community from pesticide drift. And then there's impacts with neonicotinoid seed and on row crops, and in terms of impacting invertebrate populations on adjacent prairies. But I don't have any data on the actual impact on a remnant prairie, since we don't do broadcast spraying of pesticides on remnant prairies, that is.
And I think I'd like to add too, while of course we do need to be careful with chemicals, if we did not have herbicides to judiciously spot control invasive plants, prairie biodiversity would decline. And so if we want to maintain prairie diversity, we have to use tools that include careful use of herbicide for spot treatment of invasive plants. Another question that has come in is, what about cooperation between the EPA regulations that have changed radically and other federal agencies and the groups that are trying to protect our remnant lands? Can you address that? Of course, the EPA doesn't necessarily work as much in terms of natural community conservation, but could you address that, Mike?
Yeah, changing rules with EPA licensing or the definition of wetlands in terms of our Missouri remnant prairies, right now it doesn't have a big impact. What's impacted Missouri prairies the most recently would be, ongoing invasive exotic species, particularly Sericea lespedeza, as well as a spike a few years ago in the price of corn, where we saw a number of privately owned native prairies get converted to row crops. So agricultural economics, I think, plays a lot more into the status of our native prairies than any EPA rules or regulations at this point would.
Yeah, very good point. And I'll just add too, this is one reason why the Prairie Foundation advocates for strong conservation measures in the Farm Bill, which is an omnibus bill passed every 4 years that includes many conservation measures that can include and help address some of those agricultural pressures on remnant communities. Another question, what other fish live in prairies that have a water source besides the Topeka shiner?
Boy, I'm not the expert to answer here. There are other people. We do know that at the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Golden Prairie, there's a natural spring which feeds a headwater creek, which has found a number of different fish species. We'd have to look that up, but I do know, and Kara, you can corroborate this, the Arkansas darter, which is a conservative fish species, occurs at Golden Prairie, which is kind of a neat prairie headwater stream fish species.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, we do have an article on fish in prairie streams. We had fisheries biologists from the Missouri Department of Conservation were generous to conduct fish surveys on streams on Prairie Foundation prairies. And of course, they've done surveys on other prairie streams. And I will add a link to that article in an email that Felicia is going to send out to all registrants tomorrow. There's another question about, Allison asks, I'm curious if there are any ethnobotanists who work in the Missouri prairie types, like people who look at indigenous knowledge, for example, from the Osage tribe.
Yes. Now, of course, the Osage Plains and the Osage Prairies of Missouri extend into Kansas and also into Oklahoma a bit. And Kelly Kinchner, who is a professor at University of Kansas, is a really excellent ethnobotanist and has written a number of books and has worked with the Osage as well as the Potawatomi and other Native American tribes in the Kansas area and the Great Plains on native uses of plants. And so, yeah, if you look up Kelly Kinchner, I think his last name is spelled Kidncher at University of Kansas. Yeah, his group of students and him have really explored that a lot.
Great, thank you. And other questions about is Kentucky fescue invasive? I answered a question that tall fescue is invasive, but I'm not as familiar with how the invasive nature of Kentucky fescue. Do you know?
Well, the tall fescue that we have, and Steve Klubine could probably make sure that I'm saying this right, is Kentucky 31, typically, which is a type of tall fescue developed in Kentucky. That's more common. That's the most commonly planted fescue, I believe, but I would need to double check on that. But I'm pretty sure Kentucky 31 is invasive. Fescue, of course, is not as invasive as Sericea lespedeza, but it's still definitely a species of concern in terms of invasion.
Okay, great, thanks. There's some more questions. Why does it take so long for the soil in a restored prairie to reestablish the microenvironment?
That's a good question that scientists are still trying to understand and learn. We really don't know. A lot of these microorganisms and fungi and things probably don't move as quickly across the landscape, so they don't disperse. They're very low dispersal rate. So it takes many years for that to rebuild and reestablish. And it may be that in some prairies that are planted, we may actually have to bring plugs of soil or small areas of mycorrhizae and other microbes from remnant prairies and reestablish them. It's an interesting kind of cutting edge topic in prairie ecology is restoring the soils. And it really, we don't have a clear answer right now, but there's a number of references out there and some publications that look at this. And I know that the Prairie Journal, Missouri Prairie Journal, has had some articles on prairie soil, which would be a place to learn more.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll also add that for some restoration and reconstruction projects, sometimes a small amount of soil is taken and not inoculated into other land itself, but used to grow prairie plants that are then transplanted into a reconstructed area. Another question, I'm curious if visiting prairies and natural areas in Missouri, quote, hurts them. For example, in alpine areas, hiking can damage vulnerable areas. Are Missouri areas similarly sensitive?
They could be if we had a real rush on some of these prairie types. Some small remnant prairies could potentially be overwhelmed, but you'd have to have a lot of people walking over them. So unless something changes and we get a football field stadium sized crowd on our prairies, which would be great in one respect, but not so good in another. Yeah, just a few people walking across the prairie, even our bottomland prairies is not an issue. It isn't causing any more damage than white-tailed deer do moving across a prairie, or other, mammals do. So yeah, the answer is, small groups of people, which is typically what you have on a prairie. It can handle it. And prairies are, they're adapted to having occasional, large mammals roam across them and over time, as long as there's a recovery period. So they're not as fragile as, say, an alpine meadow, but they do have limits to the amount of trampling and compaction.
Thank you. Question, are there any efforts to grow endangered prairie plants on private property, even people's backyards? I grow native plants in my yard, and I would love to help sustain endangered plants in my yard if I had the chance and the right growing conditions. Could you address that, Mike?
Well, certain botanical gardens, such as the Missouri Botanical Garden and Powell Gardens in Kansas City, are doing propagation of endangered plants. But then those are they're contained within an institution, a garden setting, and then oftentimes transplanted out into remnant habitats. Because there's so little seed of our endangered plant species available, we usually don't, it would be hard to outsource that to private individuals to put, in their backyards. That being said, there's plenty of other prairie plant, native plant species that are easily available through native plant suppliers that really help overall biodiversity, with pollinators visiting them in our, in our backyards and in our own private properties.
Thanks, Mike. Let's see, well, there's so many questions, but I think we can go up until 5. I mean, I don't think we'll run out of Zoom, whatever juice. Let's see, there was a question about controlling invasives without using herbicides. Could you address that, Mike?
It can be done on it's all a matter of scale. If you have a very small prairie planting of a few acres or a yard, you can control most of the invasive exotic species without herbicide. It's more labor intensive. But when we deal with, thousands of acres of land being managed by just a few people, it rapidly becomes impractical to control invasive exotic species without the use of herbicides. But at a small scale, it's a possibility, but not for areas greater than a few acres.
Mike, if I could add to that, I would just like to point out too, we're really in a race against time. And if we want to bring these species into the future with us, we don't have a lot of time. And so we have to make the best choices that we can to work as quickly as we can, which supports what you were saying. The other thing I'd like to mention is, we can have impacts in other ways. Even if we put black plastic down on the ground to kill invasive plants, that heat kills soil microbes. I mean, it's difficult to not have an action that doesn't have a consequence of some kind.
Well, and another thing too is that some of these invasive exotic plant species like Sericea lespedeza are allelopathic in themselves, and so if left unchecked at scale, you're losing species and you're changing the soil chemistry at the same time, doing more damage than a lot of the herbicides that we use in the long run can occur.
Thank you, Mike. Another question from James. James Foppel, can you speak on the hope of efforts to reintroduce animals in decline to our remnant prairies, such as recent attempts to add the American burying beetle back in Missouri after it having no longer been found here? Why would it be able to survive here now after disappearing from the remnants we have when only grazing or haying were happening on them? Connectivity is still an issue. What has changed aside from the removal of these processes and the reintroduction of fire that would give new hope?
Yeah, the American burying beetle, I would have to defer to folks with St. Louis Zoo and then Steve Bubeck, who's a natural history biologist here with the Conservation Department, because it's kind of a mystery species. It was widespread across the eastern U.S. and then into the Great Plains states, and it has winked out over a century. But it's not a prairie specialist. Now it utilizes prairies very well, but it also occurs in other habitat types. And I just would not be the expert. I would defer to Steve and the entomologist at the St. Louis Zoo, because that's beyond my ability to confidently answer.
If I could add to, I think what James is saying is, if it disappeared, and do we have a hope of reintroducing it when we have such a fragmented habitat? And I guess one other way to answer it is, we don't know, but we can try.
Well, we are reintroducing it at Wakanta Prairie, and
right.
It's seemingly it's too early to say, but it's seemingly doing pretty good.
Great, and James, I think, was just using that as an example. That there could be other species, and I guess my answer would be because we can try, and we can try to examine what factors cause its demise and see if we can correct those. Let's see, there's some other questions about converting lawn. Is there a type of regular lawn grass we can seed our yard with that is better than another as far as having environmental benefits? Or are there other ground covers that some people might call weeds that would be better to have in your lawn? And so go for it, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, Kentucky bluegrass is not bad in and of itself, but it doesn't add any biodiversity. And there are a number of ground covers you can use. If you have a really dry site that's not a really dry, but at least a sunny site that's at least well drained, you could use buffalo grass, but that can be a little bit difficult to establish. But there's all sorts of other native ground covers, depending on how much shade you have, your soil conditions, how often you might mow. There's a lot of good information out there, and the Grow Native information and Missouri Prairie Foundation website would be a place to start.
If I could follow up too, Mike, we did recently just do a little video on native plants you can use for dry, shady landscapes, and a lot of these are the ground covers. And I did a little video of our yard, and Mike Leahy is my husband, so it's our yard, but it's on our YouTube channel, and I think we posted it on Facebook, but that might give you some ideas of some natives for dry shade that also are like ground covers. And I think it's also important to note, you don't have to get rid of your entire lawn. You might, keep the lawn that you use, for a picnic or for playing ball or whatever. And then the parts that you don't use, you can convert to native. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing, but you can reduce your lawn and then add natives. Let's see, there's a question about glade restoration. I've read a little about the importance of reintroducing prescribed fire, beginning with a low intensity burn so as not to damage intact seed beds and soil structure. Can you offer a suggested strategy for fire reintroduction, that is burn timing and frequency?
Yeah, there's a lot of information on glade restoration that we've learned, and one critical element is if oftentimes you have a glade that's just chock full of cedar, and if you have really a lot of cedar and you cut it all down, you have a tremendous amount of fuel load. You can sterilize the soil and create a worse condition than if you hadn't done that. So we've gotten more smart about restoring glades, taking your time, doing it in small pieces. It's labor intensive, but cutting the cedar and then creating brush piles and burning those brush piles in the wintertime under cool conditions can really help, rather than cutting all the cedar down at once and creating a really high fuel load. So there are different techniques to do that. And then fall and winter burns are preferred if you can do them in terms of keeping conditions a little less volatile than a very hot, dry spring day with a lot of fuel load. So there are different methods to restore glades out there that take that into account.
Okay, great. And there was a question about cedars. Is it a good practice to remove red cedar trees from a prairie? What are the negative impacts of red cedar on the soil and/or prairie?
Well, red cedar itself will shade out in the prairie plants, and of course, young cedars are easily killed by fire, but as they get larger, in the absence of fire, they eventually shade out, as well as do change soil chemistry in a large cedar thicket and exclude other native plants, so you end up just with a cedar thicket. So they do have a very detrimental effect on our native prairies.
Great, thank you. And there were some questions about, can people see this presentation? It's being streamed on Facebook, and so a recording of it will be there. So if you can get onto Facebook there, you'll be able to see it. And Felicia will send an email tomorrow to everybody who registered with links to all of these different things that we've talked about. Let's see, I hope I have answered all of the questions that people had. If anybody has any other questions, you could reply maybe tomorrow to the email or send them on our Facebook page, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. There is another, Kurt Odendahl had a comment about cedars, that they also can really take up a lot of water. They can absorb 30 to 50 gallons of water per day. So that's another aspect of cedar invasion. Oh, there's another, let's see, question about what's the best milkweed for monarch butterflies. I would say there's probably about 8 species in Missouri that are really good for monarchs. Common milkweed and marsh milkweed are really good. It can depend on what time in their migration. Some milkweed species are better for them at different points in their migration, but in general, I think if you plant common and marsh, those are 2 really good ones and easily found in the landscaping trade. So I think with that, I think we're going to sign off. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks.